I can tell you I do a lot of things at WHYY and have done so for the last 30 years plus. I won't go into all of them, just let me say that I suppose my chief job is to be Patrick Stoner's mentor and idol. And I know that's the way he feels about me, and it's a heavy burden, but nonetheless one that I take gladly. And we've had a lot of fun working together over these last 30 years. But the real reason I'm here is that Jerry has asked me to introduce our panelists today on the subject of John Roberts, one of the true broadcast pioneers of Philadelphia, a man whom many of us remember. I remember him from his days at Channel 6. But more than that, his connection to me is profound, if somewhat maybe, one step away from actually knowing him very well. I knew him a little bit, but not that well. But think about this. Along with Jerry, and I'm sure many other people in this room, I went to WRTI as a member of the Temple student body and learned my craft there. And then after I went there, I've spent, I guess 90% of my career at WHYY. Those two institutions, I scarcely need to tell you, have two things in common, or one thing in common, really, I should say, and that is they were both founded or co-founded by John Roberts. So in many ways, I would not be the man or the broadcaster I am today without that man's profound influence. So that's why I'm very happy to accept Jerry's invitation to introduce our panel today, who have other connections to John that I know you'll be very glad to hear about. We're going to start with a lady who's probably the most familiar face of any of us here today, Jane Norman, thanks to her 17 years starring on local and then national television as that unforgettable sprite, Pixanne. She could fly, she could sing, she could dance, she could tell wonderful stories. And Jane, I hope you won't mind too much if I indulge myself in the observation that you look pretty darn cute in those tights, too. And I'm also told she can still fit into that costume after all these years, and that's a pretty good accomplishment. And Jane's success as Pixanne really was rooted in a deep devotion to children, which also led her to later success as a children's author. Well, that's not where it ends. This multi-talented lady's accomplishments include making up a composition, a musical composition, when she was 8 years old that was performed by none other than the Philadelphia Orchestra. So you can see how these pile up. And ever since that time, she has pursued a successful singing career right up to the present day. Now, I'm not going to say that her talents were molded entirely due to her years at Temple and at WRTI. They run much too deep for that, of course. But they sure didn't hurt in harnessing those talents as they've done for all of us. Thanks, of course, to the guidance of John Roberts. So I'll call Jane up and let her tell you more.
I don't know if I can live up to that. I really don't, but it was a wonderful introduction. Thank you. I probably did not know John Roberts as well as many of you did. However, when I look out there, I see at least maybe 5, 10 people who were students of his, as I was. And therefore, we know John Roberts in a very, very special way. When I first came to Temple University, which was probably a zillion years ago, I first entered the radio and television course. And yes, ladies and gentlemen, that's what we called it back then, radio and television. We didn't have a fancy name like communications. And we certainly didn't have a fancy, big, wonderful, gorgeous building like they have today. But it didn't matter because, you guessed it, we had John Roberts at the helm. He was incredibly incisive. He was so bright. He was welcoming. He was tough, but he was an incredible mentor and a marvelous educator. And as you said, Ed, I think all of us who were in that department lived our lives at the station that he created, WRTI. We lived there, and I truly think, and I'll bet you'll agree with me, it was probably everything we needed to know about radio. We learned it at WRTI. And then, of course, it was hands-on. It was student-run, student-operated. We did everything there. And above and beyond all of that, aside from the fact that he was an incredible mentor, he and his wonderful staff, and by the way, we were taught by the likes of Lou Klein, Gary Gears, remember him? They were marvelous instructors, and they gave us the confidence to go out into the real world, and we really believed that we would be able to get a terrific job in radio and television. And I don't necessarily think that's the same today. Because when I go to universities and colleges and I talk to grad students, I do not get the feeling from them that they really believe they're going to be able to go out into the world and make a good living in the broadcasting business. But we did. In fact, I think some of us were a little bit cocky and maybe overconfident, because one day I walked in off the street, no resume, I wouldn't recommend that today, no appointment, and I walked into Channel 10. And I said, I would like to see the program director. Crazy. Well, he happened to be there, and he saw me, sat me down in his office and said, okay, kid, what can I do for you? And I looked at him and I said, well, sir, I really think it's what I can do for you. And I cringe. I cringe when I think that I really said that. Anyway, he had a sense of humor, and he said, uh-huh, and what would that be, young lady? And I said, well, I believe that I can do the best children's show for you in Channel 10 ever. Long pause. Well, he either thought I was crazy, or he thought I had more chutzpah than anybody else, or maybe he believed me, because 1 month later, I was on the air with Pixan. But that's not the important thing. The important thing is that John Roberts was truly one of the good guys in our business. Those of us who have been doing this for a while know the good guys, and we know the ones that are not quite so good. But I think that all of us can say that John Roberts was truly the best. And for that, we love him, admire him, honor him, and salute him today. We love you, John.
Yeah, thank you, Jane. I just want to follow up very quickly on what you were saying about the influence he had, John Roberts. The single best bit of information I had in any broadcast class came from his. A very simple thing, probably some of us, I guess all of us, take it for granted, but it was a truism that has guided so many of us in our careers, and that is, you are talking to one person. That is something I, up until that moment, had never thought of before, and you all know what a difference that makes when you're broadcasting over the airwaves, the knowledge that you truly are talking to one person. Best bit of advice I've ever gotten. Now, as for the rest of our panel, this is going to be done on an alphabetical basis. So Dave Conant, if you look at your schedule, you will see that you are up next. You don't even have to check, I'm telling you right now. Dave Conant, for over 40 years, a man who has defined what I consider to be the very honorable role of classical DJ. First on the late lamented WFLN, where I got to know him all those decades ago, about 40 years I'd say, now over 40 years. And then of course starting in 1997 at WRTI, where he is to this day. And I can honestly tell you in all sincerity that of all the people I have met in the broadcasting game in all those years, he is the one man whose voice, that basso profundo voice of his, is the one that I truly envy more than anyone else I've ever met. Dave's leadership skills, in addition to all of that vocal talent, have led him into executive positions at both of the stations he worked at, first at WFLN, where he was executive director, and then the same at WRTI. And I will tell you that much to the chagrin of his many devoted listeners, Dave has recently sort of stepped away from his morning drive microphone to devote full time to his executive role at the station. And it's in that multiple role at WHYY that makes him a natural choice to join us on our panel today to discuss the legacy of WRTI's John Roberts. So, Dave, come on up and take it away.
Ed, if you weren't going to say it, I was going to remind you that it was 41 years ago that we worked together for the very first time. People have asked me recently, well, you must feel better now that you don't have to get up at 3:30 in the morning to go on the air. If you own a cat, the cat knows when it's fed, so there is a natural alarm clock yet. And I'm still in early. I first met John Roberts when I came to Philadelphia in 1964. We were on opposite sides of the television screen, though. I only met him once in person. Shook his hand. He was giving a broadcast course at Temple Center City. It was probably about 30 years ago. But I live his legacy now. Many people in here, I'm sure, have had experience with WRTI. Maybe you don't know the legacy there. He began the station with the help of the Philadelphia Inquirer and WFIL. They provided broadcast equipment. That was 1948. It was a closed circuit station. In 53, the station was up to an FM covering the immediate Philadelphia area. The signal was boosted in 58. In 68, the station moved to what eventually became a very crowded space attached to the Annenberg building on Temple's campus. In the 80s, the station bought translators, transmitters, and was able to broadcast to northeastern Pennsylvania, to the Jersey Shore, to southern Delaware. In the 90s, 4,000 square feet became much too small, and people on staff began looking around Temple's campus for increasingly fewer and fewer places to expand. It wasn't until the mid to late 1990s that some grant money came to the university, and it still took another 7 or 8 years before a building was erected. And that, in 2004, is where the station is located now. Entire third floor, state-of-the-art, beautiful broadcast facility. Now that takes me, to move forward, that takes me to my crossing paths, figuratively, with John Roberts. One morning, a beautiful September day in 1997, I was finishing up my air shift, reading the Inquirer, and found out that on this Wednesday morning, the station's format would change 2 days hence. The format would go to WRTI, and so would I. I'm sure nobody in here has ever read in the newspaper that their job had just been terminated. But I think one of the other definitions of success is not getting fired in radio. So far, so good. So 1997, WRTI, which had been for about 10 years, or about 20 years, an all-jazz station, took WFLN's music library and format, and for half the day, classical music, the daytime hours, 6A to 6P, and then jazz for the evening. A friend of mine at the time said that was a perfect blend of formats because he could listen to the Ride of the Valkyries on the way home and then open up a bottle of wine and light up a toke and listen to jazz for the rest of the night. But right now, what John Roberts began in 1948 is a station with 14 markets, from Harrisburg to Ocean City, Atlantic City, Dover, Delaware, to Scranton, Wilkes-Barre, and an incredibly loyal audience. So thanks to John Roberts, we have a wonderful mix of classical music and jazz still on the radio in this market. still providing hours of enjoyment to almost 500,000 people a week. So that is my story with John, and I really wish that I had known him personally. But that very first time, that beautiful delivery, that polished voice, never forget it. Thanks.
Thank you, Dave. I loved, Dave once let us know about his greatest goal in life, which I think is one that we should all follow. He said his greatest goal in life was to live to be 100 or to die trying. And so far you've done very well, Dave. You're doing a fine job. Dave, thank you. And we have another Dave coming up for you next, who's right next door on the Alphabet area, Dave Custis, as a matter of fact. Dave is the founder and curator of one of the largest privately owned music libraries in the country. Over the past 66 years, Dave has assembled and cross-referenced an entire collection of recordings which consist of over 55,000 records in original sleeves or album covers. That's the very definition of mint condition. And not only that, this one-of-a-kind music library is cross-referenced on over 140,000 3x5 file cards. This is before the days of computers, obviously, when they got started. His cataloging includes items from the old radio and television show Your Hit Parade. I remember that, and I know a lot of you do too. Began on NBC Radio in 1935 and ran on NBC television until 1958. He's got that catalog. You know, Dave, I think it might not be a bad idea to invite the Antiques Roadshow to stop by your place, do a little bit of an appraisal. You might be very impressed in what they tell you. But nonetheless, Dave Custis and John Roberts were very close personal friends and served together on the Broadcast Pioneers Board of Directors. So I know he has some personal things to say about John Roberts. So Dave Custis, come on up.
Thank you for that. I don't need to say anymore. Well, I live in Wynmoor, Pennsylvania, and John Roberts lived a few blocks from me at that time. He's moved 4 different times. He also lived in another part. My parents and my brother and I were the first to move in the Stotesbury estate. It's a very well-known estate. And he's lived there, and then he moved over to my old stamping ground over in Lafayette Hill, and then finally to Rydell Park. So I got to know him very well, and I used to bring him out to these luncheons each month for a long while. But I got my start with standing on my front porch one day, and I had no job, and I could look over the top of the trees and the houses across. I mean, I could see the very peak of a 580-foot tower on Mermaid Lane in Wynmoor. And I thought, I wonder what's being done with that. So I decided to go down to the township building and look up the records. I found the George Vaughan Company had just bought it. So I went to see the younger brother, Abe, about the station. And I asked him what they're planning to do. They'd already put up a little wooden shack for the station. They had a transmitter and a console there, but they hadn't even selected the music. So I took it upon myself to put their whole library together, and I based their library on mine, which is all the big bands and all the vocal groups and the chorus. And so they asked me if after I'd put this library together from February of '59, they asked me if I would put the station on air for them. Well, I'd never had any experience in radio. I hadn't thought about it, but I decided to go ahead. Now, on the 11th of November of 1959 was the beginning of WQAL, 106.1 on the FM dial. So I looked around for a good national anthem, and the one I found was, of all people, Henry Mancini. Now, he's done a whole album of just classical music and the marches and things of that sort. So that was the 45 I'd opened the station with. And within 6 months, QAL was the #1 FM station in the entire area. Now, we had a powerful signal. We got to New York State, down to New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, almost out to Harrisburg. Well, after 6 months, it was the #1 station. But all this time, Abe Vaughan came up to the station one night around 8 o'clock. I was on the air from 6 until midnight, 7 days a week. And Abe came in and says, Dave, are you interested in radio? I said, well, I can't continue working for nothing. So I tried to joke about it. And he said, well, we can't afford to pay her very much. It'll probably be about a nickel an hour. He wasn't kidding. They put me on the payroll at $25, not for the hour, not for the day, for the whole week of 36 hours a week. So anyway, that was my beginning radio. Now, I did get to know John Roberts. And oddly enough, he and Agnes used to come over to the Whistle Stop restaurant in Orland. And we sat at the same table and got to be very good friends, very close. And evidently Agnes, his wife, and I were pretty much on the same plane as far as being a conservative, where John never joined the conversation. We just had a constant chatter about it, and we enjoyed everything about it. So one day, John came over without Agnes, and we just sat at the same table. He says, Dave, you know, I'm a very jealous man. That told me something about John. But anyway, we got to be good friends, so I'd bring him out. When they finally moved over to Rydell Park, I'd pick him up each month and bring him out here, and so we got along quite well for a long while. Now, John died some months ago, and we decided to honor Agnes. But someone stepped on her foot, and some of the tendons in her, so she can't walk, and she's told to stay with her feet up and all that. But it was nice to know John all these years, and since we were paying honor to John, and everyone had a chance to sign that card, I'll take it over to Agnes this evening. And I guess all this was about me more than about John, but I understand John will understand. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dave Custis. I've just been asked, by the way, I don't want to forget to mention this, been asked by our photographer that when our little chats are done, and while Charlie Gracie is getting ready to perform, we've been asked to pose for a little picture, so don't go scattering until that is done, and you want to stick around for Charlie anyway. Sam Feinberg's relationship with John Roberts probably goes back further than anyone else's at this table today. I'll tell you more about that in just a second. Suffice it to say that Sam has enjoyed one of the most successful careers that I know of in station management, including WKBS, Katz Television, and at WPHL, Channel 17. One of his signal accomplishments there many years ago was to successfully woo the Philadelphia Phillies broadcasts away from Channel 6. Those of us who go back far enough remember when Channel 6 meant the Phillies in the old days. Well, he negotiated a contract with them that they accepted, and that, along with a few other things, really established WPHL once and for all, and to this day, that station still carries many of the Phillies games. And I'll tell you, there's one small area of his life that Sam has in common with me. He'd never guess it in a million years. Turns out we both started our college careers at Drexel University, and we both hated it. Now, that has nothing to do with Drexel University, which is one of our fine schools. But suffice it to say that neither Sam nor I had any ability for mathematics or engineering. I don't know how we wound up there. But I can also tell you that we both found our real callings at Temple University's School of Communications. And I know that Sam will share some of his warm reminiscences about his experiences with John Roberts. Sam Feinberg.
I want to thank you for those kind words. You read the abridged version. You should see the unabridged version. I guess I'm one of the people who met John Roberts earlier than anyone else. I started at Temple in 1949 and graduated in 51. And at that time, the department was called Department of Radio, Speech, and Theater in the Liberal Arts College. Then later, of course, it went into the business school. And from the very beginning, John Roberts was, how do you put it? He gave us a feeling of professionalism about the broadcast business. He respected the business. You meet a lot of people who are naysayers and so forth, but he was very straightforward about the business and how we should handle it. I remember Ed, that same comment about, remember you're talking one-to-one, and it was very true. I started out, I thought I wanted to be an announcer. I found that to be very boring, with all due respect to all announcers. And I then went into actually running a classical music program 1 day a week. And I remember using as the introduction Darius Milhaud's Suite Française as the introduction to it. And actually, although we only got to about 3 or 4 blocks, a couple people did ask me, they said, gee, I didn't know you were interested in music, so we did have a small audience. There was a wonderful feeling of camaraderie at the station. We were a very small group. I don't think we were more than about 18 or 20. And the place where we hung out, a lot of people went to Mitten Hall, which was fine, but we came to the basement of the station, and we had our little group there. We were all commiserated with one another. We didn't know where we were going to get jobs. But John Roberts, and a couple of times, was very encouraging. And I think a lot of us felt that we had a chance, as Pixan said, about getting into the business. And that's certainly the way I felt. By the way, as I look around this room, I see some people who I worked with, Dory Lenz, Len Stevens, who had the great idea to hire me as the first employee of Channel 17. And I had a lot of fun. I wanted, if I may, tell you one personal incident that happened at the station. I happened to be a long-time opera fan. And one day, John Roberts in his class gave us an assignment of ad-libbing a 3 or 4 minute bit in case we were ever on the air as announcers and something happened and we didn't have anything to say. So we went home and we prepared something. So since I knew a bit about opera, I chose to tell the story of a great Russian basso named Fyodor Shalyapin, who was the man who introduced Boris Godunov to the Western world way back under Toscanini at Milan. Anyway, the story was that Shalyapin came out in the role of Mephistopheles. This is not Gounod's Faust. This is Boito's Mephistopheles, and he was painted all in gold leaf down from his chest down to his waist. So I got up to tell that story, and I was fine until I got to the point, and I said he was covered in gold paint or leaf from his chest, from his neck down to his. I couldn't think of the word waist. I couldn't think of the word midriff. I said he covered to his belly button. And I remember John broke up. I thought, pretty funny. So much for ad-libbing. I had a chance to talk a couple times when I was at Channel 17 with John, and one of the things I had mentioned to him, I said, we went through 3.5 or 4 years of training, but nobody ever talked about a rating book. And I said, you know, dollars follow ratings. That's the mantra of the business. And he pointed out that they had then were beginning to introduce looking at rating, beginning to know what they were. I never even knew what a rating book was until I got a job at, my first job was at the Inquirer for $33 a week. I left that after 2 weeks to for a raise in pay to WKDN at $35 a week. So, but that's where the first time I heard the word rating. I had never known about it. But I think there was this feeling of professionalism that he conveyed to us. And I think most of us that were in that group really took that away in terms of how we should act on our own behalf. So I was always grateful to him. We had a couple of lunches that we reminisced together, and I really enjoyed the man. I'm sorry I didn't get to see him when the last time I think I saw him was here at a Pioneers meeting, and I'm just sorry that his wife wasn't there. I'd like to would have said hello to her. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, and I think it's been an honor to be able to corral these reminiscences about one of the true broadcast pioneers and a true gentleman, John Roberts.